You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 511 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer at RT and has written articles that are published at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show and the daily news roundup that I write. Will, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Thanks, Kyle. I'm doing all right. How you doing?
Doing well. It's been a crazy few months, but maybe the peak of the lunacy, I guess, maybe not like just the insanity on the streets of America, but of just the absurd things that are said. I think we may have hit the peak with this whole New York Times Afghanistan funding from the GRU story, where you have so many people just going back and asserting that Russia, Harry Reid, like a week ago, just straight up asserting that Russia manipulated the vote totals. But, I'm even seeing like former Senator Claire McCaskill, Chris Murphy tweeting out things like, well, we know Russia helped Trump win in 2016 and Trump wants their help in 2020. And so, of course, he's going to ignore this. And so, we'll get into the Afghanistan piece later on. But I think a subject that's very worthy of our coverage today is the damage of Russiagate and how much it's hurt the U.S.-Russian policy, what Trump has done as president, his actual decisions that have actually affected U.S.-Russian policy, despite what you hear in the mainstream media, has been extremely hawkish. So, I guess we do have to start with the whole Russiagate thing, Will, and the whole thing is really collapsing in on itself. And so why don't you take a couple minutes to just quickly explain how Russiagate has gone from this grand elaborate conspiracy to who anybody is paying attention, just a burning pit of lies and corrections and editorial notes and false assertions from the mainstream media.
Yeah. So I think it is good. We're getting fairly close here to the end of Trump's first term. Whether there will be a second one, I think remains to be seen. But I think it is useful to kind of look back and take account of where things are at after his first term here. And there's a lot to consider. We've covered this pretty much as it's happened in real time. But I think it is really useful to look back at the U.S.-Russia relationship and sort of the effects that this whole Trump-Russia collusion story has had on it. And not only because Trump campaigned on improving ties with Russia, but because we are talking here about the two, largest hydrogen bomb arsenals on planet Earth. And so, how we get on, how our two countries get on is important in and of itself. But it also has extra relevance because Trump had campaigned on improving relations. So, it's good to take account of that. And we've covered this Russiagate thing, many, many times over the last 3.5 years or so. And it's grown into such a massive body of claims that there's been so much to address. You could really fill up a lot of airtime and word counts with, trying to explain and debunk all this stuff. But I think we have shown that the three major aspects of this story have been pretty much discredited and debunked. And so there's the claim that the Russians hacked into, Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and the Democratic National Committee. There's the claim that the Russians waged this social media disinformation campaign using their troll farm, the Internet Research Agency. And then there's, of course, the claim that the Trump campaign had actively cooperated and was aware of all that happening. And I think those three things, you can go back in the archives if you want. And we will have some work up soon here, getting into more detail into all these major legs of Russiagate. But all these things have been pretty much either, outright disproven, or it's been shown that they're highly questionable claims that really lack evidence. But regardless of that, even though this stuff has been discredited time and time again, this has still had a major effect. It's had, I think, the intended effect on the Trump administration and its policies, specifically toward Russia. You might even say it's hemmed him in other ways too, in other areas of foreign policy. But for Russia, like most certainly it has hemmed him in, this Russiagate theory. And so, like, swinging back a little bit to when Trump first took office, when he was campaigning, he kind of broke taboos during the race, the 2016 race, and like freaked out some people in the foreign policy establishment. I think what we call the blob. He kept talking about improving ties with the Russians and with North Korea, just sort of saying like, why not? Why can't we get along with these countries? He slammed endless wars in the Middle East, said they're wasteful and, we had been lied into them. He even said during one of the debates, quite like surprisingly, he said NATO might be obsolete. Just all this stuff that who knows if he was sincere about this stuff too. I think a lot of this, you could argue that these were just sort of like, this is empty talk. But even just saying this was enough to like really freak out some people in the U.S., the D.C. foreign policy establishment. And so this whole Russiagate story basically started with the Clinton campaign, trying to spin an embarrassing email leak from WikiLeaks in the summer of 2016, spinning this into an attack on Trump and saying that the emails had been stolen in a Russian hack and that, him and Trump and Putin were in cahoots. And so this, campaign tactic, basically, this is what this started as from the Clinton campaign, very quickly became this massive, powerful attack on President Trump. And we've seen it like really grow over the last 3 years into something like, monolithic and crazy. And almost immediately after the Clinton campaign started talking about this Russia stuff, you have the FBI opening up its Crossfire Hurricane investigation into the Trump campaign. And so there is some kind of weird stuff here early on, too, where it kind of looks like some of this may have had its origin within intelligence communities, like the FBI, and you have John Brennan at the CIA in particular having a role here. And it seems like they maybe had a deeper role than, we might even know, that maybe the Clinton campaign wasn't really the origin of this, and that this really did, this was incubated in an intelligence agency. But regardless, though, the Democratic Party and Clinton's people first led the charge pushing this whole idea of Trump-Russia claims. And the intelligence agencies would come and back it up a little bit later. And so this idea, once it sort of like was floated, once it was, the Clinton campaign started claiming it, the intelligence community they released 2 reports on this. It really exploded and took off. And, before long, like after Trump had actually taken office, you had like every single news agency, every pundit was basically, this was like the talk of the town, that, Trump-Russia collusion and how the Russians had gamed our democracy and how Trump was basically a traitor. And so, like, this is a pretty big deal. It's kind of an unprecedented story in American politics to have this concerted of a drive to call the president a traitor. And despite the fact you've had all these retracted stories, in some cases you've even had journalists resign or be fired, nonetheless, you've had this story just like pile up endlessly into this like legend of Russiagate. And so that has had an incredible amount of power, I think, on Trump's presidency. And so we've really started to see it have effects on his policies. It's not just a matter of like his rhetoric or anything. It is, he's actually taken actions because of this theory. And so to really start getting into the policy stuff, like early on, within the first few months of his administration, Trump had allowed allowed Montenegro to join NATO. And NATO, obviously, he had like I said, he had called it obsolete. He had slammed it. He had said that I think he even at some point threatened to like pull out of it or something. Really showed skepticism toward this agency, but almost, within months of taking office, he completely reversed that and pretty much jumped right in lockstep with all the hawks and saying that, oh yeah, we have to expand NATO to push back against the Russians. And, there was this pretty famous, I guess, or something that we remember, a Senate debate between Senator John McCain and Senator Rand Paul, where McCain said Rand Paul was working for Vladimir Putin because he was opposing Montenegro's bid to join NATO. And so I think Trump probably saw that. And, I think he saw that what might be in store for him if he were to oppose that move. And so without batting an eye, he easily approved Montenegro's, bid to join NATO. And so that was just like the start. That was one of the first things that we've seen in his presidency of being pressured into a more hawkish stance toward Russia and a more accommodating stance toward NATO. You had Trump's a little bit later, a couple months later, you had him agreeing to sell Javelin missiles to Ukraine. And in Ukraine, they're fighting with these Russian-speaking separatists in the east. And so that's all being spun into we have to fight a proxy war with the Russians. And so Trump was easily persuaded into selling missiles to Ukraine to snub the Russians. He started ramping up sanctions after 2018. Like I think just in 2018 alone there were 6 rounds of sanctions targeting all kinds of things in Russia. And then, I'll let you cut in here because I think some of the most important policy changes are with some of these arms control treaties. And we've had the INF treaty. It was something that Trump killed, I think, in 2018. And so I'll kick it over to you. I've said a lot. There's a lot to go over here.
Right. Well, I think one of the important things you highlight there is that Montenegro into NATO vote, because not only does Rand Paul get accused of, being a Putin's puppet on the floor of the Senate, but the vote is, I think, like 98-1. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't 99-1 because Jeff Sessions was either already the DOJ or was trying to become, and it wasn't voting at the time. So, this is unanimous from the foreign policy, like the political spectrum from, I know that the far right, or whatever you want to call it, if it's, Mitch McConnell or Ted Cruz or, whoever you perceive as being the far right other than Rand Paul, all the way to Bernie Sanders on the left, are all 100% on board with this foreign policy consensus of NATO expansion and, interfering in Europe and the world. I guess one of the things that you have to talk about when you talk about Trump's foreign policy and how hawkish he's been towards Russia, a key country in all of this is Ukraine. And so go ahead and can you kind of take us through this Ukraine saga? I know it kind of starts before Trump, and so we have to mention that a little bit, but particularly how Trump has escalated the U.S. aggressive policy towards Russia in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. So Ukraine has had like a pretty substantial role, I think, in sort of seeing this escalation with Moscow that we've seen under Trump especially, but that started under Barack Obama. We've covered this on the show before, but the Obama administration had a very significant role in backing the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, which helped to install an administration there that was very hostile to Russia. One of the first acts of that administration was to to abolish Russian as one of the official languages in the country, because there's like a major Russian-speaking population in the East. And so that really, like during that whole Ukraine debacle, Russia actually annexed Crimea, which had previously been Russian territory that was handed over to Ukraine under the Soviet Union. And that move really galvanized this whole rhetorical ploy and policy ploy against Russia of Russian aggression. Like this became like a major slogan in the media. And so, yeah, under the Obama administration, policies or relations with Russia really deteriorated because of this whole Ukraine thing. And so Trump has sort of continued that. The Obama administration, despite installing the new government in Ukraine, was actually reluctant to sell it weapons. There were some pretty unsavory elements within the new Ukrainian government that we helped to install. There was some ultra nationalists or even neo-Nazi elements within that. And so Obama was actually hesitant to sell them weapons, and Trump, reversed that policy. And during the 2016 campaign, actually, during the race, a big story had come out. Trump was like torn apart in the media because his campaign had apparently tried to alter the Republican Party platform on arming Ukraine to be against it. And so it was this huge thing that's, something Vladimir Putin is sure to love. And so after a few months of that, he was eventually sort of coerced or pressured into changing that position. He did sell, I think, 2 different rounds of Javelin anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainian government. And not to mention, I think he's also extended sanctions that the U.S. imposed over the whole Crimea thing. And so Trump has, I think, even outdone Obama on the Ukraine aspect of the whole Russia story.
Right, absolutely. And some of those javelins, I believe, have come on the complete dime of the U.S. taxpayer in the form of military aid. And in recent weeks, even the State Department, I guess, greenlit the sale of some Mark IV patrol boats. I believe they're made by Lockheed Martin to Ukraine. That'll be about $600 million. So, that will certainly buy influence, I suppose, in D.C. for Ukraine. And, they're just continuing and, they portray it as Russian aggression, but this is, the U.S. messing around right on, Russia's border in Ukraine. And so, we've seen his Ukraine policy become far more anti-Russia. But every time you hear Ukraine come up, Will, in the media, it's talking about how Donald Trump is in bed with Vladimir Putin somehow. And so it really is one of those things that continues to baffle, that even in this case where it seems absolutely so clear that Donald Trump's policy, doing things that Obama was unwilling to do, and those policies are clearly something that Russia, like, this is Ukrainian policy is a huge deal for Russia. That's why when the U.S. overthrew the government in Ukraine and was, talking about kicking the Russians out of their naval base on the Crimean Peninsula, the Russians end up annexing Ukraine. So this is a key issue for Russia. Like, Canada would be a critical and a key issue for the United States. And it's just, again, such a clear difference between what Trump is doing and what Obama is doing. Yet, if you ask most people, especially most people who listen to like CNN, NPR, or MSNBC, the reply is going to be, Trump is soft on Ukraine and taking orders from Vladimir Putin. What do you think the main mistake is here, Will? Is it that people actually don't understand Russian policy? I mean, I know Vladimir Putin typically gives his speeches in Russian, but there's translations, and time and time again, him talking about critical issues, one being Ukraine, calling this a red line. There's others, such as accepting Georgia into NATO, or maybe these arms control treaties, and we could take it in that direction yet nets. But maybe we'll get into, just right here, how they're able to sell that difference where somehow Trump is softer on Russia, even though his direct policy in Ukraine is more aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly some of this is just like, purely partisan interests. Like, they're going to weaponize any kind of thing they possibly can against Trump, no matter how accurate or valid it actually is. But I definitely think there is a lot of misunderstanding about like Russia's, stance on Ukraine and stuff. Like, people didn't really, like, no one really imagined what, how the U.S. would have maybe reacted had Russia staged a coup in Mexico or Canada and, started threatening to take away one of our major naval bases that we had held since like the 1700s, as Russia has with its Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol there in Crimea. So people, I think, just don't like, they have a kind of a double standard. They don't really stop to think about like, how would this, go over in the U.S. if, the same kind of thing happened. And honestly, I think the U.S. probably would have done more than just like a bloodless annexation. Like, that may have been a pretext to start a new war if it were us. You might have saw the U.S. like rushing to the UN Security Council to like get resolutions passed for how we can now go stop this with our military or something. So, yeah, I think there's a combination of sort of like willful misunderstanding, willful ignorance because of partisanship, and also genuine just like misunderstanding, and maybe not a real genuine desire to understand that explains some of this.
So I figure that the next place we could go is with these arm control deals that Donald Trump has ripped up and destroyed and stomped all over during his presidency. Again, these are key issues for Russia. They want to maintain these arm control agreements, and yet, Donald Trump is going to be portrayed as being weak. But I guess to start off talking about this, you look at who Donald Trump's national security advisors have been, going from Michael Flynn, who was kind of the guy that wanted to get along more with Russia, McMaster, who was more of a standard, kind of Washington foreign policy blob guy. So, there may have been a chance to save some of these agreements. But then in walks, the ultimate destroyer piece in the world, the evil mustache himself, John Bolton. And I guess, Trump invites him in and deserves every bit of criticism that we're about to level on John Bolton, because Donald Trump absolutely should never have given him a platform. But he did it. He used it to destroy first the INF treaty. This was a really key agreement that was signed between Reagan and the USSR, but Russia continued with it after the USSR dissolved. And what it did is it prevented land-based cruise missiles that could carry nuclear weapons from having the range of, I believe, between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So this is a huge class of weapons that, because of this treaty, were dismantled. And I think it also had a cap in there on the total number of nuclear weapons. but that was, I think, lowered by the New START treaty anyways. So anyway, the Trump administration accuses Russia of having a short-range cruise missile that could fly, I believe they claimed 660 kilometers, and it was mainly designed to target China, and Russia had offered to let the U.S. examine the missile under some provisions in the treaty, but ultimately the U.S. never took Russia up on that and used that as their excuse to leave the treaty. Now, Russia had some issues with the U.S. In that treaty anyways. Internationally, drones are actually oftentimes considered cruise missiles because they're unmanned vehicles that I guess could travel, 1,000, 2,000 kilometers and, go in zigzag and go in different directions. And so Russia felt like, well, the U.S. could strap a nuclear warhead onto a Predator drone. And, that's essentially the same damn thing as putting it on a Tomahawk missile. But anyways, there was that issue. The U.S., I believe Patriot missile batteries in Eastern Europe use the same launcher that the U.S. uses for cruise missiles on different ships. It's the, I believe, Lockheed made MK-41 launcher. And so Russia said that these are technically violations of the treaty themselves. And so there was some discrepancy there. The treaty, everybody says could have been saved, could have found ways to work around it. Maybe the U.S. withdraws the missile defense systems from Eastern Europe and exchange Russia, takes some kind of measures in the missile to cap its, range a little bit more. But nope, Bolton comes in and Trump rips the thing up. And, well, I'll let you add anything you want on the INF treaty.
Yeah, I mean, this was obviously an important arms control pact if it's, eliminating like a whole class of nuclear weapons. And as far as I know, I don't think Trump really had signaled that he was planning on scrapping that until Bolton, became national security advisor. So it is interesting to see how he kind of taints things that he touches. I mean, we've covered Bolton before, but he's, had a role in destroying plenty of arms control agreements under various different administrations. Under the Bush Jr. administration, he helped to kill Clinton's agreed framework with North Korea. He helped to kill the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which is another important arms control pact with Russia. Under Trump, he also helped to drive the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, or helped to, ramp up hostilities with Iran. Like, he's always been extremely hawkish toward, anywhere you could have an opinion on arms control. He's always pushing it in the most hawkish direction. He's never met an arms control treaty that he didn't want to destroy. And so I think INF was no different here, his role in wrecking that was, I think vital to have John Bolton there.
So the next treaty up on the list, I think is more of an international agreement, but it's the Open Skies Treaty. And what this does is it allows flights and surveillance flights over every member of the treaty's agreement. I think most of the signatories to the treaty are either former Warsaw Pact member countries or NATO countries. And so Russia, I think Belarus, Poland, UK, France are all members of this treaty. Now, again, there's some issues here. Russia claims that Poland had used this treaty to be obnoxious and interfere with their flights. And so in response, they limited surveillance over their Kierkegaard enclave, Grad, I think, enclave there in off the coast of our border of Poland. Then the U.S., I believe, limited flights over the Aleutian Islands and Hawaii. And so, there's some tit for tat stuff going on, but generally this treaty is kept in place. And it's important for, surveillance and to know what different countries' weapons capabilities are, because oftentimes HOTS and countries, claim that your enemy's defense capabilities are far higher than they are, and you end up entering into arms races based on fiction. And so it was really sad that the U.S. is now getting out of this treaty as well, especially since it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of harm. I mean, they were, I think, complaining that they needed to replace the 4 spy planes that they use, and it was going to cost a couple $100 million. But then Congress throws extra F-35s in the appropriations bill that the military doesn't even want. And so if you're concerned about a couple $100,000 or $1 million, there's definitely room in the defense budget for it. It's always so strange how, Will, the price tag never comes up when you're building nukes, but getting rid of them, suddenly everybody's like, oh, $100 million. We can't do anything that helps that.
Yeah, right. And like with this one too, with the open skies, like you said, a very important confidence building measure where you allow the various countries to arrange spy surveillance flights. With both the INF and the OST treaties, like it seemed there was sort of like disputes on both sides. Both sides had some complaints, but it seemed possible to sort of fix this and to negotiate an end to that kind of dispute. But in both cases, it seems the Trump administration very much just allowed it to become like a reason to kill both agreements altogether. Even while the Russians were, kind of saying like, hey, we can discuss this. They were offering to have talks to salvage these agreements. And the U.S. was like intransigent about that and allowed both to die. So, I think sort of we can put some more of the blame on the U.S. side for some of these things.
Right. And how interesting is it that Trump is so easily swayed to the accepting, I don't know if Trump coming into office even knew the Open Skies Treaty existed. So I think it's unlikely that, he had it in his mind that he was going to get rid of this deal. In fact, when he talked on the campaign trail, the main focus was on, I'm going to get deals done. I'm the art of the deal. I'm the deal maker. I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. Hillary Clinton famously couldn't get along with Vladimir Putin because she had to say slanderous things about him, because that's the way that she does diplomacy in a pretty sick and evil way. And so it definitely seemed possible that Trump would be able to get along better with Vladimir Putin than a Hillary Clinton. Now, again, we talk about this, the idea is that he's been soft on Russia, but he's actually destroyed these 2 deals. And even more importantly, looking forward, in February of 2021, so just days after whoever is going to be, inaugurated after winning the 2020 election, they are going to, have this key arms control agreement expire. The New START treaty was negotiated in 2010. It capped both the number of total nuclear weapons, either Russia or the U.S. would possess, and at the same time, it would limit the number of nuclear warheads that are deployed. And so this really, really took it down, to the point where we can't wipe out the world several times over. Like, both countries have enough arms deployed to kill all the human beings once. So, we don't get too insane with our doomsday scenarios here. But nonetheless, it's those steps taking towards, getting the nuclear stockpiles from the tens of thousands of numbers to the thousands to the hundreds. And that was the direction that we needed to go. And unfortunately, when Trump came in and took office, he has completely been unable to get any kind of negotiations done with Russia. I think at one point he actually put John Bolton up to start this treaty. For whatever reason, he has been convinced that any future arms control agreement with Russia must include China. But we just talked about U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals are, I think like 15,000 or so now. Maybe you could correct me on how many weapons they actually have, then China only has 300, so just a very small fraction of what the U.S. and Russia have, and I think they even have less than possibly what the UK, France, and Israel has, depending on whose numbers you look at for Israel. And so China says there's no way they're getting involved, but that's kind of the poison pill. And I'll let you pick up from there with anything on the New START treaty.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the more worrying ones. I mean, we have seen the INF is a huge deal. For that to be scrapped is not good. Open skies is also a big deal too, for just sort of general relations. But in terms of serious, concrete, hard caps on the 2 largest hydrogen bomb arsenals on planet Earth, this New START is a big deal. It really limits the strategic deployments of warheads and stuff. And like you said, prevents there from being this massive proliferation of, enough firepower to destroy the world many times over. And so the New START is still in force, of course. Like you said, it expires in February 2021. But I think like it is really dangerous seeing sort of what we've seen with the Trump administration so far. If he does win a second term, I think that will spell some serious trouble for this treaty, especially if he keeps hitting on this whole China thing where he, insists China has to be, crammed into the deal, basically. Like that vastly complicates the whole thing. Like, negotiating a bilateral agreement is already a difficult enough endeavor. But then, introducing a whole new country with all of its own concerns and considerations and stuff, that's just like a massive complication. And so that really like lowers any chances that we will even have a new, an extension of New START if they insist on this China thing. And so like barring any kind of like major change of heart or change of mind from Trump, if he wins a second term, like, this could spell serious trouble for one of the most important arms control pacts, to exist right now.
Right, and I was just looking at limits the number of deployed nuclear warheads to 1,500 is the central thing in the treaty, and it does get some other nuclear tactical devices and puts caps on them as well. So again, this is huge. It needs to be extended, and I guess when we look at 2020 and the elections coming up, as terrible as Joe Biden may be, I don't know what his stance is going to be on extending New START. So we could, maybe talk about his, Russia policy a little bit, which, seems today that he's saying Donald Trump isn't hard enough on Russia despite everything we're saying. But maybe he would extend New START. It doesn't sound like Donald Trump is going to do that, and very dangerous.
Yeah, in terms of Biden and New START, like Biden has shown, pretty bad. He's also, totally fallen in line with the whole Russian aggression, Russian meddling kind of stuff. However, I do wonder with Biden, because Obama negotiated New START, I wonder if he would treat that as part of his old boss's legacy and might say, hey, like, yeah, we got to be tough on Russia, but we know we need this treaty still. Like I could see him staking out that position. And so it's possible Biden would be better on this one narrow issue than the Trump administration.
So, so we have all of this, Will, that we've talked about on the show, how Donald Trump has taken these very central key foreign policy, their top national interest issues, and has moved the ball several steps forward from where Obama did on Ukraine, and then just ripped up and destroyed these arms control agreements. He's another thing we can mention. He's deployed low yield nuclear weapons. These lower the threshold to start nuclear war. Russia has maintained that these are risky, and that if the U.S. uses one of these low-yield nuclear weapons, Russia's going to respond like it's a regular nuclear weapon. And so it's only going to be in the minds of, probably the Harvard-trained U.S. war planners, West Point-trained U.S. war planners that are coming out and saying, oh, we could use one of these weapons to intimidate Russia to show that we really mean business. And, we end up, annihilating the human race over absolutely nothing. So there's that, and then there's also sanctions and expelling diplomats, and I'll go ahead and let you end up, with anything you have on any of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to that, you also have Trump's national security strategy, which is sort of like the military's like big, like grand strategy document. And in that, he said that, they want to shift military focus from counterterrorism stuff in the Middle East to great power competition with the Russians and the Chinese. And so we've seen Trump basically preside over this massive escalation with the Russians. You listed a lot of the major things. We've already kind of run down a lot of that stuff. And I think he does sort of, outpace the Obama administration. At least Obama was sort of able to negotiate New START, and Trump has not been able to negotiate any kind of deal or anything. He's only pushed hawkish, hostile policies. The only thing you can say in his favor is that like very early on, he had some sort of like decently good rhetoric about Russia. But regardless of how hawkish he's been on Russia and all this stuff, regardless of his actual policies, even today, to this day, people are still talking as if Trump has given away the farm to Putin, as if he's like, every policy has been just perfectly exactly what Vladimir Putin would want. And so it's kind of incredible. It's surreal to even see this. Like, I don't know what Trump would have to do to convince these people otherwise. Like, I guess like invade Russia or nuke Moscow or something. That's like I don't know what other policy he could take that would convince them that he's not a puppet of Moscow. And so, even after nearly 4 years of this whole story about Trump-Russia collusion and stuff, it still is like a major driving force in our politics. that Russia is this dire threat and a menace to our democracy and this whole story. And so I don't think this whole this narrative, this conspiracy theory is with us for the long haul. And I don't think it's going to go away even when Trump does. And even if he wins another term, it'll certainly be with us. But even after his second term, if he wins one, I still think it will stick with us. Like, I think this Russia thing is here for the time, for some time to come.
Right. Well, I think the proof of that is what we see in the past couple of days. And I think this is the perfect way to transition into this New York Times article by, I think Charlie Savage was the main writer on that, which claims that an unnamed intelligence official told them, I don't even know if it's clear that the person was intelligence themselves or was aware that an unnamed intelligence official said that the Russian intelligence agency, the GRU, offered bounties to the Taliban in order to have them kill and target American soldiers. And so I guess the first thing to look at here is it wasn't like a particular spike in U.S. soldiers being killed in Afghanistan last year. And so on the face of it, I don't see really any reason to assume that there was any kind of practical impact on the ground of what happened. There's no reason to believe this. Looking at the evidence that they present, it seems like the only thing other than unnamed officials is that they have some reports from the Afghan government that upon whatever kind of interrogations that go on in Afghanistan, and I'll go ahead and let you use your imagination, but I know that some pretty terrible things go on in the police departments of the United States. But I'm sure it's probably even a little bit worse than when the cops tase somebody down and tase them, in the nuts to try to get them to cop to whatever crime they want them to cop to. And so these reports generate out that Russia was paying the Afghan government this, and now it's reported everywhere that all we're wondering is that if the Russians actually paid the Taliban after they killed a U.S. soldier.
Yeah. This whole story is kind of crazy to see the Times, like the top newspaper in the country. They're the newspaper of record to pick this up and run with it. As you kind of already hinted, like the evidence that the Times gives is completely based on the word of anonymous officials. And we don't know anything about those officials. We don't know any kind of ballpark idea of where they even work in government, whether they're lawmakers. We don't even know how many officials they talk to. It could be 2. It sounded like they had at least more than 1, or it could be 10. We have no idea. I guess I take it's probably less than more. If they had more, they probably would have specified how many officials were saying this. So it's probably 2 or 3 officials that they've got here with no names. We don't even know what level they're on. They could be very low level people. But beyond the basic assertion about this bounty scheme, the Times basically has no other information about how this works, about who's involved, about what the payments look like, and or which U.S. troop deaths actually were rewarded with bounties. Because they claim that they think they have indications that bounty money was paid, but they don't know for what troop deaths. They haven't specified or pinpointed it at all. And in one of the peripheral details they do give, they say that this intelligence is all based on interrogations they got from captured militants and criminals. So very highly trustworthy people, I guess, that this information is coming from. And so basically we have these anonymous criminals and militants possibly being interrogated under duress, making this claim to anonymous intelligence officials, and then those guys in turn brief some other anonymous officials who then leak it to the Times. And that's how that information supposedly got to us. And so, obviously I don't have any kind of definitive proof one way or the other if this happens. We were talking off air, I guess I can imagine that things like this might happen, that bounties are paid to militants to wage a proxy war. Although at the same time, I mean, the Pashtuns have been fighting foreign invaders for centuries in Afghanistan. So I'm not sure if you need Vladimir Putin to pay them a bounty to convince them to do it. I think that's just something they'll do on their own wherewithal. And so, yeah, what you have here is the Times basing this highly incendiary claim on something through 5 different layers of anonymous sources. And that ultimately goes back to some anonymous criminals and militants in Afghanistan. So that's ultimately who this is based on. And we really don't have much else, much more than that. We do have a Times follow-up today saying, like, trying to add to this, saying, like, oh, Taliban militants have been found with U.S. dollars in their possession. And so that somehow suggests a Russian plot, I guess. Although, we know that the U.S. has itself paid Taliban militants in U.S. dollars to, for protection payments and for security services through some of these, really rural areas of Afghanistan. And so, I don't know. I find this whole thing is extremely fishy, extremely incendiary. And yet, it's being picked up and run with by virtually everybody, not only the media, but lawmakers and stuff, too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. I guess one of the places I thought was worth picking up and just mentioning that if you look at, I guess, strategically what would be going on in Afghanistan, the difference of U.S. troops dying between, 20 and 40 and 50, I don't think is really going to generate the kind of political momentum in the U.S., especially with the way things work, to get the U.S. to withdraw from Afghanistan. And so even if this did go to the highest ranks of the Russian government, it seems kind of obvious that the strategy would be to bait the U.S. into staying forever, that the U.S. and the Taliban were in the middle of peace negotiations, and yeah, peace is pretty loosely used there, but all the same, they're in the middle of these negotiations. And if Russia is trying to get the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers, then it's pretty clear that the goal is to undermine those talks and, possibly destroy them and get the U.S. to stay in Afghanistan forever. And so in which case, the Donald Trump should leave. It's the easiest solution here, is that, this should just be another case that the U.S. needs to get out of the country.
Right, but yet, often his moves to withdrawal have also been, painted as somehow, I think people have claimed that it somehow benefits Russia, just like everything else he does. And so, I guess he can't win here, no matter what. But I thought one interesting part of this Times story, just after all that we've mentioned here about all this Russiagate stuff, how many of these stories have been debunked, you have this golden line in the Times write-up. It goes, quote, while some of his closest advisors, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have counseled more hawkish policies toward Russia, Mr. Trump has adopted an accommodating stance toward Moscow. And so, after 4 years of the Trump administration, or 3.5 years or whatever, all the stuff we've just talked about with sanctions, tearing up agreements, the arms race stuff, this is how the Time characterizes those last 3.5 years. As he's taken an accommodating stance toward Russia. And this to me is just wild. It's maddening. This is dangerous. This is, I don't know, taking this position consistently, the top newspaper in the United States, that they're going to characterize the last 3.5 years as an accommodating stance. That's very, I don't know. I think the audience can see how that would really push toward escalation. If that's the refrain from the entire media, from the entire establishment, when Trump has been this hawkish, what does he have to do to appease these people? I think that's awfully dangerous.
Yeah, so I think that takes me into kind of where I thought that the show should wrap up, maybe, and that was a part of this narrative is that Trump hasn't done anything. He found out about this in March and hasn't done anything. Now, there's already this CBS News reporting a senior intelligence official, unnamed, of course, so again, take it for what it is, but unnamed source against unnamed source. This one says that this was not included in the presidential daily brief, and that the president, the vice president, and the chief of staff were not informed of this. They have no idea how, high it got up the chain or why it didn't get higher. So it could be, that somebody realized this was junk intelligence and never put it in front of the president. And this is actually a lower level intelligence leak and not really anything worth noting. And that's why Trump didn't know about it. But there's this idea that Donald Trump found out about this in March and didn't do anything about it, which there's so many absurdities baked into this, Will. First of all, that if Donald Trump did find this out, that anybody would know anything about it anyway. This seems like one of those cases where, they try to set up maybe a SEAL raid. They try to catch either one of the GRU agents making the payment or to kill them. Or, it's an asymmetric warfare kind of deal where, you kill one of our guys in Afghanistan, we kill 10 of yours in Syria. We know that there's been clashes between, U.S.-backed al-Qaeda forces throughout the Syrian civil war with Assad and Russia, and that, they've shot down Russian helicopters. I believe they once shot down a Russian helicopter with a USA made and distributed TOW anti-tank missile. And there was the case of hundreds potentially of Russian mercenaries being killed by the U.S., and this was during the Trump administration. There's also, this weird proxy war thing going on in Libya right now where, there are Russian mercenaries on the ground again. The U.S. has bad different groups in that country. We carry out different drone strikes and have different operations there. And so it's very possible that this is part of a, wider covert war that, Rachel Maddow apparently can't even fathom, but that's been going on, in the Middle East for some time now. And so I don't know how they could just conclude that Donald Trump hasn't done anything, and how this in any way suggests that he's in the pocket of Vladimir Putin. And yet that, that's what this is, that's what the narrative comes out of here. And I guess, talking about why this is so dangerous is it doesn't feel like, there, when you talk about an issue in the United States, like abortion or gun control, I sometimes feel like, there's a bounds. There's what Tom Woods calls the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. And in one sense, it's not great because, I advocate for much radical solutions. But in another sense, it does kind of suggest that we're not going to get too carried away with our policies, and that, from year to year in the United States of America, it's not going to go from, abortion is death penalty to, every third baby gets aborted. That's not the range here, but it seems like, the 3x5 card of allowable opinion on this has, completely opened up on the Russia hawkish end, and there's now nobody like kind of being the bound to say like, hey, like we gotta get along with the other world nuclear superpower here.
Yeah, I mean I think that's one of the major outcomes that we've seen of this whole Russiagate thing, is that it's sort of for the first time I think since like the fall of the fall of the USSR, like we now have like the progressive moderate, or the moderate progressives and sort of like moderate Democrat types who've, they've been very hawkish before, and like they're not great, they haven't been great throughout the, in the post-Soviet era. But I think now more than ever, like there's a real consensus now between like the Russia hawks on the right, who have always been very hawkish toward Russia, but going all the way back from the Cold War. But now we have this sort of unified, like bipartisan consensus that's like really powerful and strong on this whole Russia thing. And now sort of the left side of the political spectrum, the centrist left, they're like outdoing the Russia hawks on the right. And so we do have this sort of like new dynamic that I think has been brought by this whole Russiagate thing. And so I think that's been one of its major accomplishments in the last 3.5 years is to do that and to leave us with this political establishment and this consensus that's that eager and willing for conflict with the Russians. And in terms of this New York Times piece and like, Trump not doing anything about the alleged Russian bounties, I don't know what he was supposed to do. Like, I don't know what they were supposed to see him do. Was he supposed to go on TV and criticize Vladimir Putin for this and moralize against him or something? Like, you would think, as you said, there would just sort of be some kind of like covert retaliation that we'd see, and we wouldn't see him coming out and talking about it on TV. And so how anyone knows that he did nothing in retaliation to this, I don't know. I don't know how they claim to know that. I am pretty skeptical overall that like, about this even being a thing in the first place. Like you said, that CBS reporter had said, he hadn't been told about this in the Daily Brief. So I tend to think there's like, this is probably flimsier and not very factual. But even if it did happen, even if we assume that, Trump was aware of this, I don't know how they expect to know what the retaliation would be. I don't know how they expect to know that like he didn't, he did nothing in response.
All right. Well, did I miss anything? Forget to ask you anything? Or is that pretty much? I mean, I think we did a very good job of rolling through Trump's foreign policy. It's been so hawkish against Russia, and as you point out, nothing has satisfied the lust, especially from the left, to just assert that Donald Trump is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin, and that delegitimizes his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, we've covering this many years of policy. It's a lot to go over, but I think we pretty much hit on all the major things. We will have something soon here at the Libertarian Institute, in case we missed any gaps that I think is a little maybe more comprehensive that people can watch out for.
Right. So tell people where you are on social media, because be sure to follow that so you can catch the article that should be coming out in the next day or two.
Yeah. If you want to see that article and all the stuff that I write over at RT, you can follow me at WKP_ANCAP on Twitter. That's where I share all my stuff. And I've got an author archive at a place called the Daily Sheeple, Consortium News, Antiwar.com, and of course the Libertarian Institute.
All right. And yeah, check out the Libertarian Institute for all of my work, or check out the Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Cal.